Welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast. My name is Ralph Cree. This is brought to you in association with bodyheartmindspirit.co.uk. In this episode, I talk with Dr. Mark Forman. Mark is a psychotherapist operating out of San Jose in California. He provides developmental consulting for individual adults worldwide, and is the founder and lead trainer of the Certified Integral Psychotherapist Global Training Program, and actively teaches and supervises both therapists and coaches interested in the direct application of integral theory. We talked about the distinction between psychotherapy and spiritual practice, and how they are unique tools that are best applied specifically in different situations. So you might have a spiritual experience, and the way to unpack that experience might be best done with a psychotherapist, or it might be done best with a shaman or a meditation teacher. Or the one experience might be broken into different parts, and you might take part of it to work with the psychotherapist and part of it to work with a meditation teacher, for example. So my belief is that the best way to go is to do psychotherapy and spiritual practices. They're like the two wings of a bird that fly together to help the bird fly. And I hope this conversation helps illuminate when's the most appropriate time to use which of these tools. I hope you enjoy. I certainly did. Mark Forman, welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast. And this is the first time we've met, but I've been listening to interviews you've done with other people, and we're both part of this Integral Global Facebook page, and watched you interact with people. And the topic I wanted to explore with you today is the divergence and convergence of psychotherapy and spiritual practice. And I think the crux of the question is which tool to use for what job. And I feel that in the spiritual but not religious scene, which I kind of put myself in that camp, and I think a lot of people that would listen to this episode, identify as that. I think it's quite unclear about whether something is an issue that's best dealt with a psychotherapist or a spiritual teacher. And just to outline the broad kind of pattern of this, that in pre-modern times, the psychotherapy and spiritual practices were seamlessly woven together. And I'm thinking of the Buddhist practices, for example, where you have these preliminary practices. And Daniel P. Brown, who's a very long-term practitioner of Tibetan Dzogchen and Tantric Buddhism, but also psychotherapist, has kind of described those preliminary practices as psychotherapy. And one question I'd like to explore with you today is Western style psychotherapy a better fit for Westerners rather than some of these preliminary practices that you find in Buddhist texts and those kind of things? And then when modernity hit the scene, we have this kind of separation of we've got secular psychotherapy on one hand, and then religion on the other. Not much conversation between the two, and spiritual practices or experiences are seen as quite often as infantile. It's just this what's Ken Wilber's referred to as the pre-trans fallacy. Is an important thing to bear in mind with that. And then, with the postmodern era that we're kind of in at the moment, there's been this, rather than in the sense of a thesis, the antithesis, and then a synthesis of bringing these two together, but in a way that there's some clarity between the two. It's not like you don't just merge the thesis and the antithesis together into a mush. And I feel like, what I've encountered a lot in the scene, the spiritual scene out there, for the spiritual but not religious type, is a kind of blurring between the boundaries of psychotherapy and spiritual practice, which I think is unhelpful and stops people from going deep into their psychotherapeutic work, and also stops them from going deep into their, non-ordinary transpersonal experiences that you might classify as spiritual or religious. So it's which tool to use for what job, roughly. So there's my little intro. What are your initial thoughts on that?
Well, I just want to say thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and say I certainly think quite a bit about these questions, so they're on my mind very regularly, particularly as I meet with clients and have clients who avail themselves of spiritual practices of all sorts, and also want to do psychotherapy and elements of therapy. So the question of what to use when is a very living question for me in my work. So I would say this is a good conversation, and one I expect I'll enjoy.
So, my own personal history with this, I've been doing meditation practices and things like that for 25 years or so. And for the first 10 years roughly of that, I was interested in psychotherapy. I actually started a psychology degree, but I didn't enjoy it, packed it in and went off to study Eastern religions. But so I was always been interested in psychology, but I kind of felt like the spiritual traditions I was engaging with kind of covered it all, covered the whole of life and all the territory. And it was predominantly Tibetan Buddhism I was practicing, but I was very interested in which is a kind of tantric form of Buddhism. And I was also interested in the Indian tantric tradition as well. But then I kind of hit a point after about 10 years of that where I realized I should actually, I'd always thought psychotherapy was for people that were crazy or mentally unwell, a bit like being ill and going to see a doctor. But then I realized it's just like working out your body, like looking after your body, exercising. It's healthy people do psychotherapy too. It was like an unconscious kind of prejudice I had against it, which I think is actually quite prevalent, in contemporary Western society. So then I thought, well, I'm just going to do this as an experiment. I've actually been working with the same psychotherapist for 13, 14 years. And it's really enriched my life. And it's enabled me to go deeper into my meditation practices. Psychedelics is also something I've been very interested in for a long time. Has really helped me there too, big time. And so I now know that how important it is to do psychotherapeutic work and spiritual work. And there is overlap between the two, but when I do psychotherapy work, I'm really interested in doing shadow work with my with my very personal shadow work, and then obviously with the meditation practices, I'm trying to expand into transpersonal territory. So that's how how I've come into this position of being very interested in this topic?
So I think, one way to think about it is we have two hands, and one of them is devoted, or should be devoted, to the problems and the strengths of a meaning making self, a self that has continuity in the world, a self that has likes and dislikes, strengths and weaknesses, uh, sort of triumphs and wounds on one hand. And it seems to me that people who try to ignore the pursuit of that in favor of the pursuit of something solely spiritual, which we might call the pursuit of sort of non-self, get themselves in quite a bit of trouble. And it's almost like clockwork that you can count the time, and every 5 seconds a spiritual teacher writes the article that tells the world that they didn't take themselves seriously enough, and that led to such and such problems in their community, and now they're looking more closely at who they are and where they've been and their psychological tendencies. So I believe on one hand, we have this meaning making self, apparently, that needs our attention. And that is more in the realm of psychotherapy. Then we have this capacity for transcendent states that ultimately don't point to a solid self, but to a transparent self, which is connected, if you like, with everything. And my feeling is, if you have those two hands, they're interwoven, and they actually strengthen one another, even though they seem paradoxical. They would seem that they would be at odds, but the actual reality is they're mutually supportive. And that's a little bit of a mystery. We don't know why that is, only that it seems to be sort of, as you were saying, as you do your psychotherapy, your meditation practice improves. Or conversely, a lot of people will say, I had a breakthrough in meditation, and now I'm actually able to process some things in therapy that I'm not able to. I think the danger lies in doing one of these things only, and especially in the modern world where we're asked to have a relatively complex sense of self. So we have to make choices and decisions that are grounded in the individual, as opposed to dictated by the culture, which is the old traditional way, which works great in many ways, but it is also dying off in the face of the the many splendored thing which modernity offers, which is all these expressions of self.
I was listening to Joseph Campbell the other day, and he was talking about, this East meets West moment that happens, in the over the 19th century, and gave rise to all the sort of spirituality that's so popular now in the West. And it was a kind of collectivism versus individualism moment. And, the notion of being an individual was very, very different in the West and the East. And in the East, with much more you were your role, your societal role, and you know the yeah, and and in the West, very 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 focused on this personality, and how that wasn't necessarily realized at the time. Now we can look back with hindsight, we can see that, but it created a lot of problems because you know, the lack of understanding of the cultural difference there, and I mean, we're decades on, and I think that we're still feeling the reverberations of that misunderstanding still happening now.
Yes. And I think it's a complex discussion because part of it has to do with traditionalism versus modernism. So even if you go back a certain distance in the Western tradition, you were still largely your role in society.
Yeah.
There wasn't necessarily a well articulated individual self. Now, I think the West has, for lots of reasons, but mainly because it's in our Judeo-Christian roots to place some primacy on the individual in a way which I think is interesting and has been unfolding for a couple of thousands of years. I do think the West has a bit of a head start and a set of expectations around that that's different from the East. It's more well developed. That said, like meditation is something of a universal. So, you know, you take an average Westerner and you put them on a meditation retreat, and more or less they're going to start having a lot of the experiences that the Easterners would have. There's some common pathways there. And now we know this really quite well, particularly as we have Buddhist meditation teachers or yoga teachers or what have you who've been practicing for 40 years. And, you know, they don't, I don't think they place meditation as some sort of Eastern only process. It's a human process that they've undertaken and recommend to people. And likewise, my experience, and I would say this working as a psychotherapist with people from 20 different countries, probably, since I live in the Bay Area, California, which is highly populated with immigrants, and then the first generation children of immigrants, that psychotherapy is similarly universal for people. It makes, as people get into it, it makes just as much sense for them, regardless of where they're from. They can find their place in the therapeutic dialogue and derive benefits from it just like everybody else. And there's research to support this, that people from different cultural backgrounds all benefit from psychotherapy. Some cultural backgrounds have folks staying in therapy for shorter periods of time. So there's a difference there. But the nature and the effectiveness of psychotherapy doesn't change according to the culture of the person. I'll end with a little anecdote. I had a cross-cultural psychology teacher in graduate school. His name was Henry Poon, and he was a psychologist from China. And this was, as you might imagine, there were lots of questions is psychotherapy just a Western imposition on the world, that we were sort of colonizing the minds of other cultures and other people? And so I said to Professor Poon, I said, why do you want why do you want to emulate what we're doing if what we're doing is, tainted with the biases of Western history? Why do you want to take this back to China as he had been? And he said to me something I'll never forget. He said, "This is what we have." In other words, psychotherapy is this art form that the world has, and we're going to use it in China. And perhaps it requires a few tweaks, but more or less it works. And so it behooves us in China and in other locales to learn the art and then tweak it for the culture. And since then, I've worked with other psychologists in China, Japan. I mean, it just doesn't, the same principles are very effective. And then it's just down to the small but important differences between cultures.
Yeah, I love that you're calling it a human thing, because one of the thing so I done some training in voice dialogue, some of which involved a few weekends spent with a group of about 20 people, and you go very, very deep in these sort of sharing sessions. So I, have had a bit of analogy to sharing circles, because I've sat through some really long and tortuous ones. So I was a little bit, when we started doing this in these sessions, I wasn't sure about what was going to happen, but something about the specifics of that particular group meant that it didn't become one of these really self-indulgent ones, which just go on and on. But I mean, so basically, we were pulling back the curtain on our own lives and dreams and difficulties and traumas, and just very, very openly to each other. And what I realized after doing this quite a lot was that it was a pathway to feeling a great connection with people and humans, and I really felt that we were one, like this kind of big human family, almost like one person, one giant person. That the details, surface details, are always different with people's life stories, but there's so many similarities, and having done that quite a bit and gone really deeply, it kind of led to this very visceral and emotionally vibrant sense of being connected with all people, and that sort of a distinction. I mean, that's, you have your own individual psychotherapeutic sessions, but doing group therapy too. And then there were people represented from different cultures there, for sure, different countries. I don't know how many countries were represented, but it'd be, I could imagine doing that with 50 different people from 50 different countries all together, and then coming out of that feeling very much connected with people. And yeah, one thing,
yes.
critique I did have about the voice dialogue thing, which you made me think of something you said earlier, was that we went a whole year without anybody asking the question, who is aware of our personalities? That we didn't really touch into the transpersonal dimension of who we are.
Yeah.
and I realized that you could do it. You could do a lifetime of deep voice dialogue training, without ever asking the big questions like, that who is, like, in the style of Ramana Maharshi, who is aware of your personality. It's a really, really deep question, and it's been the crux of my meditation practice, for example, for many, many years. I felt I got really into the big mind process that Genpo Roshi created for quite a number of years, and I felt like he kind of addressed that gap in the voice dialogue process by actually moving into these transpersonal voices.
Yep. So I think, there are a couple of approaches to this larger question of how you address both psychotherapeutic content and spiritual content. And one approach is that you just cross train, meaning you go to your local, authentic practice group or authentic relating group, or you see your therapist, do your voice dialogue. But then, next weekend you go and you sit a meditation retreat, and you practice, concentration on the breath and so on and so forth. And by and by, you move towards a more integrated sense of self because you're doing these two things. Now, the newer way is that teachers are becoming increasingly a bit more hybridized themselves. So I'm not that familiar with Genpo Roshi. I know a little bit about Big Mind, but it clearly is a practice that has a therapeutic element, but then also has a spiritual element. And so you're trying to practice some version of both at the same time. I am of the preference that I like to cross train a bit more, because I like the focus of just doing therapy when I'm doing therapy and not having this little exit ramp of, well, who knows, who is the knower of these therapeutic thoughts. I like on my meditation retreat, to not think too much about my personal self, in order to do the retreat. I like the purity of doing the practices. And then I trust myself to the best I can to bring them both home and make sense of where they both fit. I would say the future, though, is probably in both cross training, but also in what are going to be newer hybridized forms of psycho-spiritual practice. And of course, that isn't entirely just new. There were people like Roberto Assagioli who founded psychosynthesis. He was a colleague in some fashion of Freud's, but really quite the first integral psychotherapist. And his system really addressed both. So he's an early version of a hybrid model. And I think people will just continually be trained in both. Diamond Heart is another one that I think of as, it's a psychological tradition. It has a therapeutic element that's pretty significant, and it also has a lot of spiritual practice and state training.
Is that A.H. Almas, the Diamond Approach?
Almost.
Yeah. That's the one.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so I've been very much in the cross training way of doing things. I started doing this, actually started doing integral life practice in 2007. And, it kind of started out quite partitioned. But I think, as you say, over the years, it's without even trying to consciously work it all out, how it all fits together, you just, it just becomes baked in, because ultimately you are one person, So, so when I do, like you were saying, the psychotherapeutic work I do with, is a guy called Gary Hawke. He's part of the integral world. He does spiritual practices and body training and psychotherapy. I know that he knows the whole context of the human condition. But when we do therapy, we go very much on the personal level. And he and I know that I have a tendency to spiritualize events or a situation, and I'm always trying to escape to that bigger context, like and we might get into spiritual bypassing in a bit in our conversation, but he's always pulling me back to the the personal level, and it's like, stop, don't run away from this very real and personal pain you're trying to just numb by so taking this bigger, wider context. But then, because I'm doing that work, as like you were saying, when I do the meditation practice, I can really let go of all of that and go very deep into the transpersonal stuff. And it's the last thing to say, that what you're saying had made me think of, is I'd heard Roger Walsh, who does a lot of these very long Dzogchen retreats, and he helps out with answering people's questions, students that have questions in break times. And the vast majority of the questions he was being asked were psychotherapeutic questions, not to do with Dzogchen meditation. And there's nothing wrong with asking psychotherapeutic questions, but a Dzogchen meditation retreat, you're kind of blowing your chance. So if you're sitting with someone like Roger Walsh, who's got years and years and years of very, very deep practice, you're blowing the opportunity to ask him some very, very precise questions about Dzogchen meditation on something that you could, like, get any psychotherapist in your local town could help you with that,
Yes. And so, meditation and spiritual practice can be sort of the back door into psychotherapeutic practices or psychotherapeutic questions. And I think that's a consequence of, the relative immaturity of a practitioner to know what the questions they have that are most important. So in other words, if someone does a Dzogchen retreat and ends up with a psychotherapeutic question, probably they miscalculated a bit what they need right now, and may have internalized some of the messaging that spiritual practice will take care of everything. There's still a lot of that out there, despite increasing pushback that is not the case. And that's not a heavy judgment on people. I just think it's an experience piece, meaning the more experience you have cross-training doing both, the more you're able to identify what it is that you're pulled to train or work at a given time. And that should be based on some of the problems that you're having. So, reliably, psychotherapeutic problems have to do with confusions about love or confusions about work or family, confusions about self-identity in these very different contexts. Um, and so if we're having some of those very normal problems of who am I in this family of people, and how can I address these conflicts in myself or in someone else in my intimate circle, that's a psychotherapeutic question first and foremost. uh, you can go on a meditation retreat with all that stuff in the hopes of surrendering some of it. However, it's an imperfect solution. More likely, you're going to enter states of consciousness which are powerful and helpful as an overall tonic, you might say, but you're still going to have that same communication problem in most cases when you return home. And of course, that's the background of the famous quip: if you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your family.
Yeah.
Um, so so I would say in that Roger Walsh case, it's probably a mix up. Um, there is a way I like to think about the difference between psychotherapy and spirituality, at least as a basic difference. And what I think it is that psychotherapeutic practices um, require your energy to move down and out into the world. So the self who engages in the world sort of reaches into the world to make connection with people, with situations, with relationships. So it's almost as if your psychotherapy, you're leaning in to the normal world. And meditation, at least the beginning, which can be a long time, but the practices at the beginning are really about drawing the energy in and then up, so that you begin to cultivate states of witnessing observation that are a little bit removed from from time and space and the the sort of energy of the manifest world that's in front of you. And so the cross training piece is to be able in your meditation to draw up and back a little bit towards a warm detachment, you might say. But then in a psychotherapeutic moment, to allow your energy to flow forward and engage the person and the world that's in front of you. And that people develop a strong preference rather than a flexible, energetic body that will do both things. And the best way to practice it is to put yourself in environments where each is being cultivated and practice cultivating it. But then when you go to another environment and practice the other one. And at first, it's almost like two qualities like strength and flexibility seem to be at odds with one another. But if you do cross training, you can be very strong and yet very flexible.
Yeah, that I like that. It's made me think of this term that I've heard Tim Freak use called the unividual, and so there's some convergence of the kind of cosmic, universal, and the very personal and individual. And sometimes I have these kind of yearnings for God, goddess, the divine, and like in a kind of moment of prayer, it's like I'm saying basically, I want to be you, to the object of my yearning, the God or goddess, and then the reply that comes back is, well, I want to be you, and it's you can't, it's just not just a one-way thing. If you're going to become me, you've got to let me pour myself right into you, and explore. Another way to say it would be, consciousness has this innate drive to explore every nook and cranny of all the perspectives out there in every single species, and the more you do your psychotherapeutic work, you're a little bit like one of those cave divers that exploring those unexplored caves, and mapping out and just shedding light and populating these nooks and crannies that are quite dark, difficult to get into, but that's where consciousness and God and goddess wants to go in there, because it's endlessly fascinating for consciousness to explore those things. So it's a little bit like reminds me of the saying where the gods, I think this comes from the ancient Greeks, that the gods were jealous of humans because they were mortal and everything meant so much as a result of that. And when you're immortal, you're sort of, there's this kind of meaningless and listlessness that comes with that. Yeah.
Yes, I like that a lot. And it reminds me of some spiritual teachers. I think Adyashanti comes to mind, who talk about the prospect of sort of waking up to your true nature in a spiritual sense, but then using that as a way to explore the relative self, which is a process I've heard him say really feels quite endless, sort of how the non-dual self, if you like, interacts with the relative self, but that it's easier to do in that order because you're less attached.
And you have more courage. I think once you know the parts of yourself which are genuinely fearless, and I'm thinking of two ways you could describe those. You've got this sort of the formless awareness side of things, and then you've got the more divine goddess, Mother Nature, form side of it, the transpersonal form side of the equation. Once you've got some relationship with those parts of yourself and out there in the wider context, it gives you the courage to do this really painful, quite focused and sensitive work. You're prodding the delicate bits of yourself, and if all you've got is your personality, your persona, that's the only tool you've got to kind of bring to that process. There's no way to hold the pain, I think, in a way, or it's overwhelming. The pain sort of becomes you, and there's no way to hold that.
Yep. So I was thinking, if someone were listening to this conversation, they might ask, well, where do you start? And what I would say is, there's no time like the present. So it's good to start now. But what do you start with? I think the two most basic things are that you allow yourself or put yourself in a situation to do therapeutic activities. And that could look like traditional therapy, that could look like group practices. There are so many things out there that are related to therapy. At least if you live near a modern cultural city, there are a great many practices to try, which have a therapeutic feeling. So that's one thing to start doing. And the other is to explore and take up a meditation practice of some sort. And of course, that can be the traditional sitting meditation, but it could be a moving meditation like Tai Chi or yoga or a walking meditation. There are many variations. There's lots of good apps now that will take you through meditation, like uh, Headspace or Sam Harris's Waking Up app, etc. But since both therapy and meditation take a long time to learn, if you just set yourself on the pathway with those two practices, um, you'll reap the benefits going forward in time. They both really pay off.
And I think it's an adventure and it's a journey, and to not have too many expectations about where you're heading necessarily with it. To just be curious, be adventurous, just do the practice and then see what happens. It's like we so often want to know the destination that we're headed to. And I think one of the great jokes of the path of meditation is that at a certain point you realize that there isn't a destination that you're getting to. And the same with the psychotherapeutic work, as you said earlier, it just goes on and on and on, deeper and deeper and deeper. And it is inherently rewarding, the process itself. And it's just that alone is a good mindset to have to start with this stuff, I'd say.
Yes. So what I hear you saying is you're talking about the shift between goal-orientated thinking and process-orientated thinking. And what I would say is that's a valuable shift. So instead of wanting to bake 10 apple pies today, what you really want is to enjoy the process of baking. And if you happen to make 10, great. But if you happen to make 7 and you loved it, that's process orientated thinking. The only thing I would say is that comes itself with time.
Oh, absolutely.
And that at the beginning, when you're starting, it's actually quite good to have goals. If the goal is to be a kinder, better communicator, more peaceful, more focused, that's lovely. And those are good goals. And as you're saying, it can be also terrific to put down goals and just be open. But I think most people need some time before they can appreciate the process orientated type of focus, that those of us who've been doing it for a very long time, enjoy so much.
Yeah, I mean, I can sit here having done so many years of these practices and say, oh, there's no goal, and it just goes on and on and on, and it's just inherently worth doing in itself. But but I've done thousands of hours of work. It's like, I can't, not saying, yeah. And I think that's one of the, this is, they're generally called sort of the secret teachings, that they were kind of secret because you didn't really want you to find out that there is no goal or whatever too early on, because you need to actually understand that through having put the effort in. So otherwise it's not an embodied recognition of that fact. It's you can just sort of say, oh right, okay, well that's the way it is, and I understand it, when you actually don't.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to explore with you is psychedelics. A deep 5-hour psychedelics experience can feel subjectively like you've had 5 years of psychotherapy. And now I think, like so many of the things we're talking about here, there's a grain of truth there, but also, you don't want to overblow it. And I think there's also this thing where it's very important to not just buy your first person experience of something take the whole thing and say, well, that was just what it was, and I've just sorted all my traumas out. I've done this one ayahuasca session or had 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms and that's it. It's like I'm sorted. What would be your advice to people because psychedelics really seem to sit in this middle ground between psychotherapy and spiritual practice. There's most psychedelics have a very, very distinct and marked psychological dimension. They give you these great insights into the workings of your own mind. And also they put you into these non-ordinary states where your normal reference points have gone. So, you're having transpersonal experiences at the same time. So it's kind of, I can see how people could imagine separating, some quite standard psychotherapeutic practice from a quite standard meditation practice. But where do you feel psychedelics sits with that? And, like, how could people pick this apart? Because I know from my own experience and many people I've met, you can become completely deluded about what you've actually been through and what you understand through these experiences.
Yeah. So as a psychologist, I'm quite excited about the potential of psychedelics, particularly as this new generation of research has come in the last 5 years, really showing that psychedelics, but also including ecstasy or MDMA, can have real benefits, particularly for the treatment of trauma in adulthood, is how I would characterize it. And articles are coming out with a lot of frequency, and these drugs appear to be more effective, certainly, than anything we have now for addressing trauma. So that's just one thing I would say. I would say also that they're probably not appropriate for everybody. So if you have any bipolar tendencies, or if you have psychosis or schizophrenia in your family tree, you probably want to skip the psychedelics. That might not be the case with MDMA, which is not really a psychedelic per se. It's an empathy. It's a drug that produces tremendous amounts of empathy, but not the fireworks of ayahuasca or psilocybin or any of that cluster of psychedelics. how do I see them? Uh, they are very much what you describe. So they take people on journeys, which often have profound spiritual and profound personal meaning and content. Uh, and then where I often see it is they come back into my office after their retreat and they're sort of blown wide open, and they are trying to integrate what they have just learned. And the problem is, for a couple of reasons, I think the integration is a lot tougher than people would suppose, partially because they were on a rocket ride of an experience and it's hard to return there. Whereas in contrast, meditative experiences, very often, if you get into a state, you can then sit the next day and perhaps duplicate that state. So there's a repetition feature of meditation, which is harder in psychedelics. Um, but I think if people can focus their journey, the aftermath of the journey on what were the main messages, what were the big things that they felt called to understand, they'll do a lot better. As opposed to trying to grasp all that one might be aware of in a 5-hour journey, which I just think is too much to process, to be honest. So I think focused integration. So very often a client will go in with a question: how do I relate to my difficult sister? We fight all the time. What's happening there? And so they'll have a journey and they'll be shown some kind of information about their sister that feels deep and spiritual about their relationship together. And then they'll receive a message about how they need to approach their sister differently. And those are the kinds of things, when they come back into therapy, that's what I'm most interested in hearing, because those can be carried forward as action steps. Now, the only thing I would say that I also know from so many clients with so many psychedelic sessions is that the psychedelic trip does not solve all problems. It does not solve childhood traumatic episodes because they're so complicated. It might help with an aspect of that, but it's not going to, if someone was sexually molested as a child, it's not going to erase that karma in one fell swoop. I'm more optimistic about adult trauma, which is a different phenomena for a couple of reasons. But I just have seen people come out of the journeys and think that they now understand all of their childhood, but those karmas, if you like, are so powerful that they just reassert themselves. And so you have to take pieces of the journey and apply it to pieces of the trauma. But I'm a little afraid that there's going to be so much hype around these substances when they become fully integrated into treatment that people are going to say, I solved my childhood trauma by doing this journey, and it's going to turn out to not be true, and it's going to lead to frustration.
Yeah. I think there's having realistic expectations is so important in life. We can have such grandiose expectations of our own abilities, or the potential of a particular substance, or this teacher, that teacher, this book, this new method. Makes me think of as some famous, I think it was the highest ranking American military guy to be a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and he was saying that it was the people that were the most realistic about their situation that fared the best, and people that were too pessimistic, it didn't work out. If they were too optimistic either, it didn't work out. And there's this kind of sweet spot, where you're being a bit more authentic about yourself and life and the situation. And another thing that I was thinking of, that you were just alluding to there, is that you could have a psychedelic trip, then take the psychological content to your psychotherapist, work on that, then take some of the more non-ordinary states of of self identity and that you'd experienced, and discuss that with a shaman or a meditation teacher, or so it's kind of breaking that one experience apart and dealing with it in two different ways with the appropriate people. And I think might be a better way to go than try and bore your psychotherapist with all the meeting the aliens and all that stuff, and in the same way, bore your meditation teacher with all your kind of talk about your relationship with your girlfriend and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I would even say you'd probably bore your meditation teacher with your altered state. They would say,
okay,
that's nice, let it pass, and keep practicing. But I do think the shaman, the healer who works, so for audience members who may not be familiar, a lot of people take this psychedelic work very responsibly, and that means journeying usually in a group, and journeying with the plant medicines with a shaman of some sort who's trained to help people have the best journeys they possibly can have. That person in that role has probably a lot to offer in terms of where the journey went on a cosmic spiritual level, that I think would be best directed towards that person.
Yeah, it's another example of using the right, well, it's not the tool, but the right person or the right approach for that particular thing. So if you meet aliens in the DMT hyperspace, a shaman who's gone there many times and knows lots about this, that's the person to talk to about that. Because as you say, you bring that up with your Dzogchen teacher or something, or your Vipassana meditation teacher, they'll be like, well, or particularly even Zen's even more brutal, isn't it? It's just, that's just a complete load of shit, just forget about it, when it isn't actually.
No,
yes. So it's like, I mean, that's interesting. So out of that one experience, we kind of come with these three directions you could go with it. Speak to a shaman about these elements, perhaps. It's not uncommon. So something like ketamine is so dissociative that you do have these experiences of formlessness. That would be good. Then a Dzogchen teacher or a sort of Vedanta practitioner, they really specialize in that kind of zone of experience. That's interesting. Well, another thing I wanted to ask you about is relationship with gods and goddesses. And so, my personal practice, I like to practice, first person, second person, and third person approach to spiritual practice. And in that second person relational dimension of my spiritual practice, I pray and communicate with gods and goddesses, for want of a better word. I mean, it's but one question that keeps coming up for me is is how do we have a relationship with excuse me, deities that isn't just us wanting to have cosmic mummy and daddy? In that, there's nothing wrong with wanting to, there's nothing wrong with wanting to have that feeling of a cosmic mummy and daddy. I'm not belittling that, but I'm saying it's not that's not the only way to relate to deities. And if that's the only way you relate to deities, there's this whole other area which is probably more spiritually potent in that area that we could develop. And it's how to discern your own relationship and expectations in that respect.
Yes, it's a good question. I think that the first part of that can be a therapeutic examination of your parents and what you did and did not get from them. We usually our parental relationships leave us with some wounds and some unfulfilled promise that might have been. And to know what that is, that I didn't receive attention from my father, that my mother was not very warm and forthcoming with her emotions, anything like that, so that you can identify on a therapeutic level what that was, and you can recognize that you want to cultivate adult relationships that have those positive qualities that you missed. So that would be a very psychotherapeutic practice and goal. Now, if you're addressing those things, and then you're thinking to yourself, I'd like to have a second person, I, thou relationship with God or goddess, then you can start off, I think, in a less confused way, less likely to be seeking a mother, father, in a way that should be really psychotherapeutic. You're going to approach the practice a little more purely. And in that case, I think prayer practice is a wonderful practice. And I think can take people very far in a type of prayer that's also has an element of meditation to it. Devotional chanting, for example, comes out of the Hindu tradition, is very much like that, has a feeling that you're cultivating a relationship. And so, I think you can do that therapeutic process. Then you can engage the second person. And then I would say, I wouldn't worry about it too much. At that point, you're probably doing the best you can, and you want to move towards things that feel healing and empowering. And so if there's a little bit of cosmic mother and father in that way mixed in there, you'll be okay. I only think it can get problematic when there's a too much projection of what your real parents were like, or what you wanted them to be like, onto the deity, I guess I would say. Did
Yeah.
that make sense?
Sorry.
Did that make sense?
Yeah, no, so I think, what you're saying there is that there's no off-the-shelf answer for that question, that you really have to explore your own unique relationship with your parents, with a psychotherapist, to kind of lay that out on the table. So you can say, well, I have a natural tendency to view a masculine deity in this way, and a feminine deity in that way. Because of who my parents were, and I can just sort of notice that coming up when I'm doing this practice, but I can also notice what else is happening, and that what else, that is the interesting part in terms of having an experience with a deity that's out of that psychological territory.
Yeah. I get quite a bit. This is something I've been interested in, but am not as it's not as natively familiar. But the Orthodox Christian tradition has a very powerful prayer tradition in it. And it involves the saying of the Jesus prayer, which is something very short, something like, Jesus, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. But they practice the repetition of the prayer and the prayer throughout the day, like mantra prayer or mantra work. But they are clearly and they will talk about it, they are praying to someone. They're praying to Jesus. They're not simply repeating a mantra that maybe they're not thinking of the meaning of it. And it's my perception that they are very much cultivating very deep states of consciousness, but leading with the second person relationship. And that's how they just talk about sort of discovering God in the heart, maybe a language that they would use. And so they're a tradition that there's quite a lot out there on the web, and you can get just a little sense of how they approach it. I think it's very rich. And I know some folks in the integral community who've actually taken part in the Orthodox tradition and have found it to be a rich source for their practice and their growth. But that's something I've been paying attention to lately and thinking about the consequences for my own practice.
Yeah, I'll check it out. That's a tradition I don't know anything about, and sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I'll send you something.
Yeah,
and
please.
I'll send something you can link for people in the comments and they watch the YouTube video. There's a couple of very good YouTube videos, one in particular that I'm thinking of that we can link for people.
Cool. What so spiritual bypassing as a concept, it's kind of just the name delivers an intuitive understanding of what it is about. But what are some of the specific what are specific examples of the classic ways people try to bypass the discomfort of their personal lives through spiritual practices like psychedelics or meditation or prayer and those kind of things? There definitely some. I know every person is unique, but there's definitely some classics out there. And what are the ones that come to mind for you?
Yes. So I have a different understanding of this than anybody else I've ever read, because probably because I was introduced to the term very early in my training, perhaps when I was 24 or 5, and saw how it got used in communities and thought that there were some problems with it. And the first problem is that,
sorry, just to interject you, it's like a term like that can become weaponized. You know,
yes,
that you just sort of beat people up with terms like that. You know.
yes. So the way that I talk about it to begin is that there's just an expectable level of bypass. So no matter what somebody's belief system is, they're going to use that belief system to fantasize a better reality than they have at this moment. And everybody does it. Almost literally. Now, not to the same degree, I suppose, but in other words, people who enter into maybe very formal religious circumstances, like a conversion to Islam or conversion to Christianity, they are going to avoid some of their life issues by fantasizing that their religious commitments are going to solve their problems. But they will naturally kind of grow out of that with time. So there's a way that there's a maturation process that allows us to be more grounded in the world and to address our issues more head on. And so I don't know that we need to critique each other as much as I have seen done using the term spiritual bypass. I think a lot of it is just growth on the path.
Yeah, what I think when you know the first part of what you said there, about having this kind of fantasy. So your fantasy is like an attractor that you set up. It's an incredibly beautiful and complex and effective mechanism of consciousness to create some kind of fantasy that you project, and that becomes the attractor that pulls you towards it. And you know that's a good thing. You know, we all want to have some kind of vision we're moving towards, and so I think, you know, that's quite an important distinction, because you need some vista you're moving towards, but at the same time, that vista can become your happy place, where it's like stuff gets real and you just want to look at that beautiful, you know, that beautiful landscape or vision of this paradise, you know.
Yes. So I relate a second type of bypass to that I call state-driven bypass. So this would be the idea that you maybe enter a meditation practice and develop different states of consciousness. And for a time in your life, you cultivate those states and actually sort of exclude a lot of mundane processes. A friend of mine called this spiritual anchoring, as opposed to spiritual bypass. So if you find somebody who is just in their practice and really diligently going deep, that's not necessarily a problem. It's often a temporary phase in life, but it does push aside sort of more worldly questions and aspects of the personality. So those are kind of more neutral or positive. Then I think there's two that I would consider the problematic ones. And one of them is what I call narcissistic bypass. And that's actually the using of spirituality to feed a narcissistic element in the self or in the personality. And that means there's a real mental health issue that's going on involving narcissism, and the spirituality becomes now a way to express that. And this is something
could you give a specific, could you make up an example of that with a bit more concreteness around it?
Sure. So that would be someone saying, I've attained enlightenment, and there's nothing more for me to learn, and therefore I'm going to tell you how this goes and what it is, and you will listen to me because I am the authority. And then there's no self-reflection past that point. There's the almost unshakable outward confidence. Now, whether inwardly the person feels that way, or whether they fight with insecurity or embarrassment or something, outwardly they don't show empathy, or they don't expose vulnerability and not knowing. So without naming names, I'm sure that listeners could probably think of a spiritual teacher or two who seems to have held that position. And I think it's very tricky. There's some spirituality is very attractive to narcissistic types because it seems to offer an answer to all the questions, and seems to offer a pedestal that you can put yourself on.
And particularly the types of spirituality practice where you become the deity yourself. I'm thinking of tantric practices and the like.
Yes.
Where two different people will approach that practice very differently. And a narcissist, that means something, becoming the deity or a deity is a very different thing for a narcissist than someone else, isn't it?
Yes. A tradition in which you either become the deity or become and then transcend the deity, and find your identification with the sort of living God, as it were, God in the moment, etc.
It's a little bit like, rather than becoming the deity on its own terms, you're becoming the deity on your own terms. That's kind of the distinction. And I think through psychotherapeutic work, you get better at recognizing the authenticity of your motives,
Yes. And so narcissism can be less severe, in which case you can work with it, and narcissism can be more severe, in which case you just have to steer clear of those persons because they will find a way to manipulate situations for their benefit. So sort of, we've done two types of spiritual bypass that are not so big of a problem. This one is a problem, although more of a problem if you run into it with other people. You might not see it in yourself. It's hard to see.
And the other thing I would want to raise there is that I've seen this happen with a few spiritual teachers, that they are basically, they're the kind of second type of narcissist you're describing. It's not just mild narcissism, it's kind of full-blown narcissism. They do something awful, all their students turn against them, they kind of go off into the woods, do their work, they make a big show of, I'm off, I'm doing my psychotherapy, and I'm doing all of these other things. And then after a couple of years, they're back doing the same thing again. But it's almost like the reset button's been pressed. And if somebody joined the story at their relaunch, they're in danger. It just happens again and again. I think that's interesting that you bring that up. So I hadn't thought of that until this moment, that there are some people that narcissism is such an issue that they're unlikely to ever get over that in their lives. And if I've skirted around different religious organizations and what some people might call cults over the years, never quite, and I've never become a full-blown member of any, but I've kind of been fascinated with that world. And I think believing that people can change, that's a good view to have in life. It's kind of giving people the benefit of the doubt, but there are some people you can't do that to, because they will just come back again and do it all again. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. So the last type of spiritual bypass is the one that I think most people mean when they use the term, which is that we overuse spiritual ideas or experiences to push away very pressing issues in our lives. So, for example, I'm going to avoid questions of what's healthy sexuality and romantic relationships, because my spiritual tradition emphasizes that you shouldn't put too much energy into pleasure or into the worldly things. And so I'm going to stay over here and remain sort of pristine, if you were, or protected from that. Money would be another issue. Money is often a taboo issue in spiritual circles. And so I'm not going to pay attention to my financial life or what steps I need to take in the future, because my tradition emphasizes poverty or just taking what comes your way. So all of these places where we can hide ourselves, and it's not just that expectable maturation process. There really are issues under there that are trying to find their way into consciousness, and we're pushing them away with spirituality. Well, and so that's what I think of what most people mean. And that happens, with some frequency, and it's where the psychotherapy is a truly powerful addition to spiritual practice, because psychotherapy should and will focus on those things. Freud said that it all boiled down to love and work. In other words, those were the two problems of life. And I believe he was correct. It all boils down to love and family or romantic relationships, friendships, or it boils down to what is my purpose in the world? How do I make a living or support others with my effort and labor? And really, there aren't too many questions outside of those questions. So psychotherapy puts those questions right up front and very starkly, so that it can help when we are doing that type of bypass, where we're putting something in the closet, as it were.
Yeah. Well, but when you describe those things, it makes me think of being a monk or a nun, and so if you live in a monastery, you don't work, so you're not having to do. I mean, you work for sure, manual work and administrative work and things like that, but you're not working for money, and your sort of survival needs are taken away because you're part. And if you think of a Tibetan monastery, for example, it's kind of in this feudal system, where they're getting donations from places, and you're celibate, so you're not having any sexual relationships. Some places you're in silence, so you don't actually have hardly any interpersonal relationships with human beings. What are the other things? Power. Some of them are just radically egalitarian, and they just. I'm thinking of Benedictine. I've been reading about Meister Eckhart and the priory that he was part of. It's radically egalitarian. So, and you can contrast that with a tantric approach to spirituality, where you're out in the world, you're having sexual relationships, you're earning money, you enter into hierarchical relationships, and you are surviving, supporting your family. You might be supporting other people, and they're quite different approaches to spirituality, and they both got long lineages and traditions. And I think there's been a recluse or being a monk or a nun is a good thing. I think being a tantric practitioner is a good thing. But how does spiritual bypassing fit into that? Because that type of bypassing you're talking about in negative terms could sound like just your run-of-the-mill monastic life as a nun or a monk.
So on one hand, I'm a bit cynical about the idea that monks and nuns live quite the simplicity of life that it would appear that they live. In other words, it's my speculation that power dynamics, politics, sexuality, a lot of these difficult issues do find their way around in monastic life. I've heard
what I was talking about is I think I was probably talking of a caricature of the monastic life, isn't it?
Yes. So I think on one hand, the caricature probably isn't accurate totally. It's not, of course, that they're having the level of immersion that a tantric would have in the world, but I do think they probably have to deal with some of these things in their own way. Now, that said, there is a rationale for devoting your entire existence to cultivating states and to cultivating the deepest possible insights into the nature of mind or reality, and that some people have that drive, and that the monastic life, even if it does have more complexities than the caricature, still has certainly more focus. So I'm thinking now of the video that I'm gonna tag for this conversation of these Orthodox monks, Orthodox monks in Greece, and they do an 8-hour prayer liturgy every day, 365 days a year.
Wow.
And they film them, and you can see these people are in another they're in another zone, from, if you know how to read a facial expression. But of course, a person with that level of immersion is gonna experience things that are either beyond what most of us will, or just with a consistency that most of us will never experience, because that, and that has an analog in the Tibetan tradition, where they will take 3-year silent meditation retreats and be meditating 20 hours a day or whatever it is. So I think there's a place in the world for this. I think it serves a purpose. I think very few people have that specific karma where that's the only thing that they're interested in, but I think people do. And I also think it's good to have those resources available for people who may spend some of their lives in a monastic way. I'm thinking of the singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen, who spent some years at a Zen monastery. And I think to have that available as well is a valuable thing. In terms of just bypassing, I think that it's likely to happen in that context, and that's some of the reason why we've seen some very potent teachers who seem to have a real degree of realization come out and struggle with the temptations of the world. So there's the protections in the monastic system to maybe help avoid that aren't there, and they think that they've really mastered the whole terrain when they've really mastered more of the spiritual terrain and not the psychotherapeutic terrain. And so they run into psychotherapeutic problems. So there is an issue of the transfer from the monastic life into a teaching role that's more in the world. And, I have some empathy for what that must be like, and, empathy for people who get caught up with teachers who end up being hurtful in some cases because their psychosexuality is not well integrated, for example. I don't know if I quite answered your question, but
yeah, no,
I went in a lot of directions there.
Yeah, it's good. And I think, somebody coming out of a retreat period, psychotherapy could really lubricate their transmission of what they've experienced, because you need to kind of synchronize your personality with other people's personalities to actually transmit information on a very basic level. And I think some people they're so out of touch with normal personalness that it's very. I'm thinking of Krishnamurti comes to mind, that he was clearly experiencing some pretty far out states of identity and consciousness, but his ability to communicate that to people, on one, it was quite, but it's very abstract and really lacked personalness. And I feel Whereas on the other hand, you got, you know, I can't bring anyone to mind at the moment, but you know, they write these very down to earth books, or you know, they have a manner of speaking that really connects with people,
Mhm.
and it might seem less than the abstract spiritual stuff, but it's just they've got this great knack and gift of the gab, or they're so keen to share their message that they'll go to the lengths of doing extensive psychotherapy just so they kind of reconnect with the human condition that we're all experiencing.
Yeah. I think of someone maybe like Ram Dass, who
Mm.
I don't know how much therapy he did, but he was certainly quite self reflective and spent a good deal of his focus on compassion for others, and therefore was a wonderful communicator, not only of the tradition, so to speak, but a communicator in human terms, in a very loving way. Now, I wasn't in any way close to Ram Dass, or so if there's more to that story, I wouldn't know. But from afar, he seems very much like uh, that he balanced himself out. Um, and that maybe even as he said, his stroke also humanized him.
Mm.
He had a very terrible stroke, and that left him with some significant speech impediment and limitations in movement, and yet he lived another 20 years, uh, and you know was in the spiritual sense, I think, humbled and grew as a result of that.
Mm.
So yes.
So we're coming right up to the end of our time together. Is there anything you feel that is an important thing to say on this subject that we haven't covered?
I would say, to those, uh, if there are those who are listening who are feel that any of this is abstract, what I would just recommend is seeing if you can find some local practices to do. So, as we've talked about, that could be a therapy group or some activity that seems like it's got some psychotherapeutic parts, and visit a local meditation center and take a class. And of course, now I'm talking about post COVID things. Obviously, there's a lot you can do online, but it's nice to show up in person if you're able. Um, for those who understand and have a grasp on, okay, I know what psychotherapy is, I know what meditation and spiritual practice is, I would say that patience is the meta virtue. These things take time, and one can push, but only so much. And more pushing does not always lead to better results. There's a Zen story I remember. A Zen student goes to his teacher and he says, well, teacher, if I meditate really hard and diligently, how long will it take me to reach enlightenment? And the Zen teacher says, 10 years. And the student says, well, if I really put in a lot of effort and work even harder, how long will it take me to reach enlightenment? And the teacher says 20 years.
Yeah.
So we want to, the best we can, let things unfold naturally and with time. And sometimes that looks like a deep dive and an immersion and doing retreats and really focusing on a practice, or psychotherapy every week to really investigate yourself. And then there are other times where less is more and a slower pace is advantageous. And to do both of these things is the work of a lifetime, which is to say, there are many markers on the path that show progress, but the path itself may be endless. And when we cultivate patience and self-understanding in that way, it eases the journey. And that's a little bit like we were talking about with process. Learn to enjoy the process itself, not just the goals.
Yeah. I've really appreciated the caring and respectful tone of your contribution to this conversation, not towards me, but towards humans, in general. It's quite common when you're talking about these kind of subjects for people to get up on their pedestal and start bashing people, for doing things wrong. And there's a kind of warmth and kindness that's come across from you, which I've really appreciated. So nurturing.
I think to the extent it's there, it comes from 20 hours a week of working directly with people and getting to know them for, going now on 20 years. And so none of this is that abstract to me in that sense. And, one day maybe my Twitter profile will reflect my otherwise good-humored tolerance. But that may be the final test of enlightenment. It's social media.
I've never touched Twitter in my life. I use Facebook, but Twitter is
Twitter or Facebook.
Yeah.
Well, Ralph, it was a total pleasure. I really appreciate you having me on your show, and I very much enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. I think the day's kind of just starting for you, and it's kind of ending for me. It's funny, isn't it? Other sides of the world. I love it.
Yeah, the interconnection we have now is something else.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Mark. I really, really appreciate it. And
okay, take care, Ralph.
Bye. I made all the music that I use in my podcasts. If you'd like to hear more of my music, please visit SoundCloud and check out my profile, Ralph Cree.